Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you exactly how you can use Google Cloud's new remote MCP servers in order to fully migrate a full stack application from your local machine to the cloud. For our workflow, we are going to be making use of Google Cloud Console as well as Cloud Shell. And we'll be making use of Gemini CLI as our main agent in order to interact with these MCP servers. For our MCP servers, we are going to be making use of the Developer Knowledge MCP server, which has access to the Developer Knowledge API and hence Google Cloud documentation. We'll also be making use of the Cloud SQL database MCP server as well as the Cloud Run MCP server. So let's get started. We'll be running this entire workflow on Cloud Shell in the Google Cloud platform. Once you're there, all you have to do is clone this MCP repository and navigate to the AllStrides application, which is our application that we want to migrate. After which, you also want to set up your credentials so that Gemini CLI is actually able to communicate with the MCP servers that are required for this workflow. And that's really simple. You can follow the instructions for that by following the code lab in the description box below. But all I did was get a Gemini API key on AI Studio for Gemini CLI. I also created an API key for the Developer Knowledge API so that I can connect to the Developer Knowledge MCP server. And I also configured the Cloud SQL MCP server and the Cloud Run MCP server. And all of this configuration happens in the Gemini settings.json file. In our main project folder, Project MCP, where we clone the MCP repository, I'm going to start and initialize Gemini CLI by typing out Gemini. As you can see, our MCP servers are now connected, and we can run this command in order to see which MCPs are connected and what their tools are. And the developer knowledge is essentially a great way for your AI agents to connect to Google Cloud's documentation. So no longer would your AI agents be generating code which potentially might not even work or run, because it would now have access to actual developer documentation in order to generate the right code samples, for example. And you can also allow your agent to make use of all of these tools here in the Cloud SQL MCP server across MySQL, PostgreSQL, as well as SQL Server fleets for natural language interactions with the database, AI-assisted app development, and also querying performance optimizations and database troubleshootings. So there's a ton of features there. We also have the Cloud Run MCP server and the tool list here. For this example, we are going to be making use of the deploy service from image tool at the very end when we are going to deploy our application to Cloud Run. Now that we have everything set up, let's start off with our first prompt to Gemini CLI. Hi, I need to choose a database platform for my AllStrides application in Google Cloud. Can you analyze documentation and prepare a tutorial to choose the correct database engine? After analyzing the application and its files, it then decided to use the Search Documents tool in the Developer Knowledge MCP server in order to identify and search Google Cloud documentation so it can come up with a better answer as to which database would be best for our AllStrides application. And once it has done that, it came up with, hey, using Cloud SQL would be the best choice for the AllStrides applications. And also it created a tutorial on exactly how we can go about migrating our application. Okay, now that we've identified that we want to use Cloud SQL, let's run the following command to tell Gemini CLI to please create a Cloud SQL for Postgres instance with the appropriate edition and version in the US Central 1 region to be a backend for our application with public IPs in the current project with 2 CPU and 8 GB memory. It's now making use of the create instance tool in the Cloud SQL MCP server to create an instance. Now we have our Cloud SQL database instance ready. We can now ask Gemini CLI to migrate all of the data that we have cloned from our GitHub repository into our Cloud SQL instance, where the new user for our application would be the database owner. And then also let's call the new database AllStrides DB and the user AllStrides. Great, our data migration has now been completed. So Gemini CLI also created a summary of exactly what we've done. We first started off by creating a database called AllStrides DB. It then created a new user called AllStrides, and then it also created a password for it. And then it imported all of our data and migrated it successfully to that newly created database. And now what we're ready to do is deploy our AllStrides application onto Cloud Run. And I'm going to be running this following instruction to Gemini CLI in order to do that. Okay, great. So our application has now been deployed to Cloud Run, and we also have a URL of where it's being deployed, so we can actually play around with it. So this is our application AllStrides, where it's a community for people who are interested in running and helping organize activities as well as tracking your progress. We can look at the events tab and we can see all of the events which are happening. And this is essentially all data that is being fed from our Cloud SQL database that we've created. We can also look at the chat, and this is also all data from the Cloud SQL database being propagated onto the application here. So this is a really great example of how you can make use of Google's remote MCP servers in order to connect with AI agents and easily deploy a full stack application from your local machine to the cloud in just a few simple steps. Hope you found this video helpful. There are going to be a lot of resources in the description box below. First off, the link to Google's MCP repository, which will contain sample applications that you can play around with. Second, you also have links to blog posts which highlight all of the latest MCP servers which are being launched by Google. And you can also check out the links to the documentation page so you can see a full list of all of Google's MCP servers.